They called my creek an unauthorized water feature, and I laughed until the trucks showed up. They thought they could bury nature under concrete. I stayed quiet, just watching. When they filled the creek that fed this land, I waited for the first rain. And when it came, every house, every fine, every rule they'd written washed away. I didn't need revenge. Justice found its own way home. The first thing you notice is the sound. Not rain. Rain has a kindness to it. A hush. This is louder, unsettled. A restless slosh under sirens that strobe against low clouds. Red and blue rake across standing water that used to be Willow Bend Drive. A mailbox floats past like a little red coffin, flag up, still expecting someone to come and collect the news. I lean into the cedar post my grandfather set by hand, the one with our brand burned in, a crooked R like a river bend. The porch boards breathe under my boots. Every gust sends a thin sheet of water off the step into the yard that once sloped clean toward the creek. Now it pools, a heavy breath the land can't exhale. Somewhere a sump pump coughs and quits. Neighbors stand in that church-like quiet that only comes when everyone knows something big has changed. A deputy in a slicker moves a cone back where it belongs and nods at nobody. Across the street, Bethany Whitfield, the HOA president and self-appointed guardian of Pretty, stands with a golf umbrella so large it could shade a county fair. The wind flips it inside out. She swats it back and checks her phone like she's expecting a text from the weather. The clipboard by her hip is wrapped in plastic, dry as a bone. I consider telling her plastic keeps records dry and creeks dead. I let the thought pass like the mailbox. Before the cement trucks and the orange vests and the language of hazards, a creek stitched through this subdivision like a lazy thread. In spring, it ran clear, talking soft to stones. In summer, it slipped in shadows, a cool relief for cattle and kids. On county maps, it has a name, but to us it was the line that taught everything where to go. The rain, the silt, the secrets you whisper when you want them carried away. My father taught me to read that line the way other boys read a box score. I came back from a spillway job in Wyoming, hoping for a quiet year. Fix the cracked hose at the pump house. Rebuild the gate latch that never caught right. Hear a lure hit the lake before dinner. Then the letters started. Heavy paper. Sans serif font. A smile that doesn't reach the eyes. Unauthorized water feature, as if I'd installed a bronze mermaid by the woodpile. The creek, they said, was a hazard to children and an attractive nuisance to wildlife. Frogs, I guess. I called and asked if anyone there had ever watched spring runoff or read a drainage map. The voice said she was just following standards. Standards travel fine on paper. Water doesn't. But that belongs to another chapter. Tonight is about the water standing where the road used to be, and the way it looks back at us like a mirror you don't want to meet. Sheriff McKay's people roll out more cones, though cones don't do much in a lake. The light bar turns the clouds into a restless ceiling. Somewhere the transformer on Maple hums under the load. I make a note without meaning to. Wind out of the west. Rise slower than the last storm. Backflow at the culvert behind Lot 14. Old habits don't leave men like me. You measure. You watch. A white county truck noses into the alley, headlamps silvering the rain. Two inspectors climb out with clipboards and a pole staff. They set the rod in the middle of Willow Bend, where the manhole has burped up a ring of foam. One calls a reading, and the other writes it down. Bethany waves like she's hailing a cab. "Over here," she calls, pointing at my lawn as if direction could push water uphill. The deputy glances at me and then away. I lift my hand in a small hello as if we were passing at the feed store. I am not going to argue in a flood. I am not going to argue ever again, not the way they want me to. When you argue with water, you raise your voice and it raises the river. The trick is to give it a way back home. The inspectors work by a maglite. They don't cross yard lines. Nobody needs the liability tonight. They look at the tablet map, and then at the standing water, and then at the map again, baffled by a creek that isn't where the lines say it should be. I can almost hear the question forming, the one I'll get in the morning with coffee gone cold on a metal desk. Where did the water go? I'll tell you where it went. It went underground, the way water does when you smother its mouth. It drove through root and loam and gravel, found the old channel under our straight lines, and kept moving with the patience of a saint and the stubbornness of sin. It pushed under driveways and along foundation footers. It pooled under the pretty pavers we laid over clay. Then, when the sky finally gave it more than the dirt could drink, it came back up to introduce itself. The patrol car slides another foot. The deputy warns a couple with a stroller to take the long way around. A man with a flashlight points at the crack yawning across his garage slab and makes a sound between a laugh and a sob. I shake the mist from my hat. On the lake, the dock bumps its posts, a polite knock that says it would rather be somewhere else. You're probably wondering how we got here. How a quiet place with tidy lawns and the promise of order ended up staring at its own reflection, counting the cost in buckled wood and damp insulation. You might want a neat answer. But the old truths don't care for neat. If you want the story, it starts before the first letter, before the first warning, before the day a yellow truck backed down this street at dawn. It starts with a creek being a creek, and a handful of people who thought paper could tell it no. I can show you the video on my phone, time-stamped and steady. I can show you the stone marker my grandfather set, and the survey pin that shines like a coin when the sun hits it in late October. I can lay out the maps on this rail and run my finger along the blue line that says where the water belongs. But some truths are better told the way the creek tells them, one bend at a time, letting the story find its own level. So we'll start here, with the sirens and the standing water, and a neighborhood learning what it costs to pave over a living line. We'll start with me on this porch, and Bethany under her impossible umbrella, and a deputy trying to pretend the cones mean anything at all. We'll start with the question the night is asking, the one that will carry us through hearings and binders and a stack of papers so high it will make a judge sigh. What happens when people try to pave over nature itself? Here's my answer, and it won't take long to show you. You're about to see how concrete forgets, but water remembers. It started months before that night of floodlights and floating mailboxes, back when the grass was still brittle from summer, and the creek still whispered soft under the willows. The HOA had always been something that lived across the main road, on the far side of the lake, where the lawns were trimmed to exact angles and the mailboxes matched like a parade. Out here, on my end of Cottonwood Bend, we kept to ourselves. People minded their fences, watched the sky, and let the land breathe. That changed the morning the letter came. It wasn't even a proper envelope, just a glossy trifold slipped between my screen door and the frame. Notice of violation, it read, in bold navy letters that might as well have been a warrant. Below that, unauthorized water feature. I stared at the word so long the ink seemed to shift. The creek, the same one that had carved its way through this patch of Montana long before any of us set down stakes, had somehow become a crime. I called the number at the bottom, expecting maybe a misunderstanding, some paperwork mix-up. Instead, I got a syrupy voice that introduced herself as Karen from compliance. She didn't laugh when I said the creek had been here since before Montana had zip codes. Our records show an unapproved modification to natural drainage, she said, like she was reading scripture. Ma'am, it's a creek, I told her. It drains itself. A pause, then the sound of typing. You'll need to submit a landscaping plan to bring the property into visual harmony with community standards. Visual harmony, I repeated, tasting the words. Does that mean cutting down the cottonwoods or painting the rocks beige? Sir, she said, her patience fraying. The HOA has rules for a reason. That's when I realized she wasn't listening. Maybe she never had to the land, or the water, or the wind that carried both. To her, the creek was an untidy blue line on a property map, and lines could be erased. The following weekend, a silver SUV rolled up my drive, tires crunching the gravel like slow applause. Out stepped Bethany Whitfield, the new HOA president. She wore a powder blue blazer despite the heat and carried a clipboard close to her chest, as if it were a badge. Her perfume hit before her smile did. Mr. Remy, she said brightly, just dropping by about the drainage issue. It's not a drainage issue, I said. It's a creek. She walked to the edge of the bank, peering down as if inspecting a crack in her kitchen tile. It's quite rustic, she said, jotting something on the page. But unfortunately, rustic isn't always safe. I looked past her at the willow roots gripping the soil, at the trickle of clear water threading between stones the color of old bone. This is natural drainage. It's protected under county code. Bethany smiled the way people do when they already plan to ignore you. Well, I'm sure we can come to a friendly resolution. In the meantime, I'll file a preliminary notice so the board can review. By Monday, there was a fluorescent tag on my gatepost and an email titled Drainage Hazard, Phase 1. They called it a temporary assessment. To me, it read like a warning shot. Marcus Reed, my neighbor from 2 lots down, came by with a thermos and a grin that didn't reach his eyes. She hit you too, huh? He said, sipping coffee like it was whiskey. Last month it was my barn roof color. Said it didn't align with the neighborhood palette. I laughed, though it sounded more like a cough. What did you do? He shrugged. Painted the whole thing beige. Then the dust turned it brown again. Nature's sense of humor. We stood there listening to the creek, the quiet kind of sound that fills your chest if you let it. You think they'll really make you change it? He asked finally. They can try, I said. But that water's got more claim to this place than any of us. For a while, nothing happened. The HOA meetings came and went behind polished doors across the subdivision, and I heard my name now and then from folks at the diner, never in kindness. The storm signs were small, a new line of stakes at the boundary, an orange flag marking inspection limits, and one morning, a county SUV idling at the curb while a man took pictures of the creek with a tablet. I called the county clerk myself, and she sighed. Mr. Remy, looks like your property's been flagged for potential runoff non-compliance under a residential drainage initiative. Initiative, I said. Who filed it? Doesn't say, but it came through HOA liaison channels. Bethany, of course. Paper trails were her favorite kind of road work. That night I sat on the porch, reading the violation letter again by the porch light. The words were neat, confident, absolute. I rubbed the corner until the paper went soft, and the thought struck me. How easy it was for someone with a keyboard to rewrite a landscape. But creeks don't sign forms. They sign their name in mud and time and the slow memory of water. The moon rose low over the ridge, pale as dust. Somewhere down the street, a sprinkler hissed, pretending it was rain. I closed the letter, set it beside my coffee, and looked at the dark ribbon cutting across my land. The air smelled like wet earth and iron. The next morning, I took photos of everything, the bank, the roots, the flow. I measured depth and angle, marked the survey points my father once showed me. If they wanted paperwork, I'd give them plenty. Still, something about Bethany's tone stayed with me. Friendly resolution. She said it like she was offering peace, but her eyes had measured every inch of that creek the way a builder measures a future driveway. 2 weeks later, another letter came, this time certified. Failure to mitigate drainage hazard, it read. Final notice. It was dated 3 Quincence, days before the cement truck arrived. I folded it neatly and set it under the salt shaker. Some truths don't need an argument. They just need proof. I thought paperwork was harmless until the trucks came. The morning they did, the air was cool, still holding the promise of autumn. A mist hung over the low ground near the creek, and the cottonwoods were just beginning to turn, yellow against the pale blue sky. The kind of morning that makes you pause, coffee in hand, to appreciate how quiet the world can be when nobody's trying to improve it. Then the rumble started. Deep, low, mechanical. It rolled through the ground before I even saw the truck, vibrating through my boots like distant thunder. I set the mug down, stepped off the porch, and saw a yellow cement mixer inching down Cottonwood Bend, escorted by a white pickup with flashing amber lights. Behind it came a smaller truck with two men in orange vests, hard hats, and a clipboard that looked suspiciously familiar. I could smell diesel and wet clay. The cement drum rotated slowly, sloshing like a stomach full of bad intentions. By the time I reached the edge of my property, the trucks had backed halfway down the alley that bordered my fence. A man was waving his arms, directing the driver with the kind of confidence that usually comes from someone who's never asked permission for anything. "Morning," I called out, keeping my voice steady. "You folks lost?" The man didn't look up. "Drainage mitigation," he shouted over the engine. "Approved work order from the HOA." "That's my creek," I said, stepping closer. "You got something in writing?" He flicked his eyes at me, just long enough for me to see they were tired. "Look, buddy, we just pour where they tell us. You got an issue, take it up with the board." The chute lowered with a hiss of hydraulics. A heavy gray slurry began to ooze from the drum, thick and slow. The smell hit first, lime and dust and something chemical that didn't belong anywhere near running water. "Hey!" I shouted, moving forward. "You're trespassing!" One of the crew lifted a hand in apology without turning around. The other adjusted the chute and motioned to keep pouring. The concrete flowed, slapping against stone and root, burying the reeds I'd trimmed by hand last week. I tried to step closer, but the ground was slick from dew. My boot slid, and I went down hard on one knee. Pain flared up my leg. By the time I pushed myself up, the damage was already spreading, gray fingers crawling down the bend of the creek like a disease. Across the street, Bethany Whitfield stood with her arms folded, watching. She wasn't wearing her blazer today, just a pale sweater and sunglasses. But even from where I stood, I could see the smirk. "Bethany," I called, my voice cracking over the engine noise. "You have no authority to do this!" She cupped her hands around her mouth, her words cutting through the roar. "It's for the safety of the neighborhood, Jake. You'll thank me when your mosquitoes are gone." My laugh came out sharp and bitter. "You're killing the land!" She shook her head like a mother indulging a stubborn child. "Just following standards." The sound of the concrete filled everything. The grind of stone, the gurgle of suffocating water. Frogs leapt from the edges, desperate for escape, but some didn't make it. The air went still except for the spinning drum. I took out my phone. The lens fogged with mist, but I kept recording. Every motion, every sound, every face. The timestamp blinked in the corner. "Smile for the county," I muttered under my breath. When the truck finally pulled away, the creek was gone. What remained looked like a scar, flat, gray, lifeless. The earth still steamed where the concrete met mud. I stood in silence, my shirt stuck to my back, my palms streaked with grit and blood from the fall. Bethany approached, clipboard in hand. "This is temporary," she said, glancing down the length of her handiwork. "Once it cures, we'll be landscaping over it. Decorative stone, maybe a fountain. It'll look lovely." "Lovely," I repeated, the word dry in my mouth. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear and gave me that HOA smile, the one that says I have a bylaw for everything you care about. You can file an appeal if you like, but the board's already voted. I took a slow breath. You'll want to keep that clipboard dry, I said. Concrete's not the only thing that hardens after a bad decision. Her brow furrowed for half a second. Then she turned and walked away, heels sinking into the damp earth. The sound of the mixer faded down the street, leaving only the drone of distant lawnmowers and the occasional croak of a survivor frog. I sat on the porch again that evening, nursing a stiff shoulder and watching the sun go down behind the cottonwoods. The gray strip of fresh concrete glowed faintly, catching the light like a wound. The creek's murmur was gone. In its place, silence, a silence so heavy it pressed against the ribs. The phone on the table buzzed. It was Marcus. "Heard the trucks," he said when I answered. "What happened?" "They filled it," I said. "Filled what?" "The creek." On the other end, there was a long exhale. "You're kidding." "No," I said, "but I've got proof." "Jake," he said quietly, "they can't just—" "They can," I cut him off. "They did, but they won't get away with it." The first stars were out when I hung up. A night breeze rustled the leaves, carrying a faint, wet smell that reminded me of a storm far off. I picked up the violation notice still lying under the salt shaker and held it to the porch light. The paper was crinkled now, the ink smeared by my thumb. The words looked smaller somehow, weaker. Let her have this round, I thought. She'd need it. Because the land remembers. The water remembers. And when it came time to answer for this, so would I. The first storm didn't come right away. It waited, like the sky was holding its breath, as if even the weather wanted to see what would happen next. September passed warm and dry, the kind of false calm that makes you forget how quickly Montana can turn from sun to flood. Every morning, the gray scar of concrete in my backyard hardened a little more, until it looked like it had always been there, unnatural but stubborn. I went about my days quietly, worked on the old barn roof, tuned the generator, tried not to look at what used to be the creek. Some nights I'd sit on the porch with a mug of coffee and watch the moonlight wash over that dead strip of gray. The frogs were gone now, and with them the hum of summer. It was too quiet, like holding a shell that used to have the sea inside it. The weather broke on a Thursday. I remember the smell before the rain, the electric tang in the air, the way the cottonwoods shivered though the wind hadn't touched them yet. The horizon turned the color of steel, and thunder rolled across the valley slow and deep, like a drumbeat out of the past. When the rain came, it came heavy and certain. The kind that doesn't patter, it pounds. I watched it from the porch at first, letting it soak the parched soil. For a while it almost looked beautiful, drops hitting the concrete channel, running in thin silver threads, gliding down toward where the creek used to bend into the willows. Then something shifted. The water stopped moving. It gathered in small pools, then larger ones, swirling but going nowhere. The concrete gleamed slick under the downpour, reflecting the yard light like a sheet of mercury. Within minutes, the puddles spread into one another, climbing over the grass and toward the back steps. By the time I put on my boots, it was too late to save anything dry. The rain hammered harder, each drop like a nail. I ran down to the edge of the slab where the creek had once swallowed the runoff like it was nothing. Now it just sat there, trapped, confused. The water rose fast, carrying twigs, leaves, bits of bark. It clawed at the edges of the lawn like an animal trying to escape. Across the fence, Marcus's motion light flicked on. He stood there under a slicker, waving. "You seeing this?" he shouted over the rain. "Every inch of it," I yelled back. "It's backing up into my shop." "Get your sump pump running." He nodded and disappeared into the dark. I turned back toward my own yard. The rain found every low spot, every dip and hollow the creek had once drained, and filled them to the brim. The sound of running water became a low roar, not from flow, but from impact. And then I saw her, Bethany, standing under a large black umbrella by the street. Even from that distance, through the curtain of rain, I could tell she was smiling. The glow of her phone screen lit her face. She was recording. I don't know what made me angrier, the sight of her or the sheer stupidity of what was happening. I wanted to yell, but the storm swallowed sound. Instead, I just stared back at her across the water that now lapped at my boots. For the first time, I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. The land was turning into a warning. By morning, the whole cul-de-sac was slick with mud and litter. The storm drains overflowed, belching up gray sludge. Children's bikes lay tipped over like shipwrecks. The air smelled of wet concrete and decay. The HOA's email went out at 9:12 a.m. Sharp. Due to unexpected weather conditions, residents are reminded to maintain proper drainage according to community standards. That was all it said. No mention of the pour. No mention of the concrete that had turned our drainage into a basin. Just a polite reminder to fix what they had broken. I spent the day taking pictures, yards submerged, driveways half sunk, mailboxes leaning. I walked the whole stretch of Cottonwood Bend with my Nikon, the strap cutting into my shoulder. Every click of the shutter felt like a statement of record. By the second storm, a week later, the smell of mildew had already settled into every garage. Mrs. Jensen from the corner house flagged me down, waving a soaked towel. "It's coming through my basement wall," she cried. I looked past her toward the street. Water ran down from the concrete slab like tears from a wound. "It's not you," I said quietly. "It's them." The HOA, in its infinite wisdom, doubled down. They sent out another memo, this one full of legal jargon about property responsibility and individual maintenance negligence. At the bottom was Bethany's signature, neat and confident. I printed it out and filed it next to my photos. One day, that folder would matter. That night, the rain returned, heavier than before. From my porch, I watched the reflection of lightning flash across the flooded yards. Somewhere nearby, a transformer popped. The neighborhood fell dark, save for the thin glow from my lantern. In that silence, broken only by thunder and the slow drowning of our street, I made a promise. They'd filled the creek with concrete. I'd fill their world with proof. Every storm would be my witness. Every drop would remember. When the clouds cleared, the neighborhood smelled like wet plaster and rot. The lawns were soggy. Tire tracks pressed deep into what used to be flower beds. Every window I passed reflected the same thing: worry. You could see it in the way folks opened their doors slower than usual, the way they glanced at their foundations before stepping outside. Bethany called an emergency HOA meeting the following Tuesday. The invitation came printed on glossy cardstock, sealed with the association's logo as if the world hadn't just turned to mud. I wasn't going to go, but Marcus stopped by that afternoon, still wiping grime off his hands from clearing his shop. "You should be there," he said. "They're spinning it." I gave a dry laugh. "They always spin it." "Yeah, but this time, the wheels are in the ditch." That night, I put on a clean shirt, the same one I wore to my father's property hearing 20 years ago, and walked down to the community hall. The lot was half full of SUVs, their chrome streaked with dried mud. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and wet carpet. Bethany stood at the front of the room under a fluorescent halo, hair perfect, voice sharper than the microphone deserved. "Residents," she began, "we've experienced unusual weather patterns, resulting in temporary drainage challenges." Unusual weather patterns. That was her phrase for 3 feet of standing water. She clicked through slides on a projector, photos of flooded lawns and blocked drains. "We must stay proactive," she said, "and follow the new inspection schedule." The crowd muttered, restless. Mrs. Jensen raised her hand. "Are you saying we're being fined for the flooding?" Bethany smiled like a teacher with a tricky student. No, just ensuring compliance with runoff guidelines. Preventive measures protect property values." A man in the back shouted, "You filled the creek!" The room went quiet. Bethany blinked, her smile freezing for a heartbeat before reforming. That work was approved under safety protocol. I stood up. By who? Her eyes found mine, cool as glass. By the board. "Show the document," I said. A ripple went through the room, low voices, shifting feet. Bethany's fingers tightened on the podium. "Mr. Remy, please sit down." I stayed standing. "You poured concrete into a natural drainage line. You didn't file with the county. You didn't notify the water board. You didn't even give written notice to adjoining landowners." Someone clapped once. Maybe Marcus. Bethany straightened her shoulders. "We're done here." "No," I said. "We're not." The microphone squealed as she unplugged it, her jaw set. "Meeting adjourned." People started filing out, whispering. A few looked at me with something like gratitude. Others with fear. They knew the HOA didn't forget faces that spoke up. I walked home under a sky still bruised from the last storm. The streetlights flickered on and off, struggling against humidity. My boots splashed through puddles that refused to drain, little mirrors reflecting every lie I'd heard that night. By the time I got home, I knew what I had to do. I cleared the kitchen table and laid out everything I'd gathered so far. Photos, emails, violation notices, HOA newsletters, satellite images from before and after the pour. Then I opened my father's old file cabinet. Inside, buried under tax receipts and faded warranties, I found a thick binder labeled Water. I didn't remember ever seeing it before. The handwriting on the cover was his, steady, deliberate. Inside were maps of the property dating back to the 1950s, water tables, soil composition charts, and letters between county engineers about protected natural drainage. I read every word until the crickets outside fell silent. The documents were old, but the law hadn't changed. The creek wasn't just mine. It was legally recognized as a protected watercourse. That meant no HOA, no developer. No one could alter it without county approval. I poured myself a glass of black coffee and stared at the binder. Each page was another nail in their coffin. But nails don't drive themselves. The next morning, I called Sarah Coleman, a local attorney with a reputation for untangling HOA messes. Her office smelled of cedar and ink. She listened while I explained, flipping through the photos without a word. When I finished, she leaned back and smiled faintly. "Jake, you've got them cornered," she said. "But you need more than anger. You need evidence that holds in daylight." "I've got a binder full." She shook her head. "You've got a story. Now make it a record." So I did. I spent the next few weeks documenting every storm, every flood, every notice. I logged timestamps, rainfall totals, even the slope of the street where the water pooled deepest. Marcus helped me set up his old drone, and we captured aerial footage after each downpour. The images told the story better than I ever could. An entire neighborhood sinking under its own arrogance. Bethany didn't stop. She sent more letters, all polite on the surface and venom underneath. Failure to maintain adequate lawn grading. Neglecting to remove debris obstructing runoff. Non-compliance with water control guidelines. I added each one to the binder. Every accusation became another exhibit. Every fine another receipt for her mistakes. Through it all, the land stayed quiet. No more frogs, no more flowing creek, just the hum of insects and the faint smell of mildew. It was the silence of something waiting. Late one night, as another storm gathered on the horizon, I stepped out onto the porch. The air felt heavy, thick with promise. I set the binder on my lap, the leather cool against my palms. Inside it lay months of work, proof that what they'd buried couldn't stay buried. Lightning flickered far off over the hills. The wind picked up, stirring the grass. The pages of the binder fluttered open on their own, like the land itself wanted to speak through them. "If the law remembers," I whispered, "so will the land." The next morning, the air was heavy with the scent of rain that hadn't fallen yet. The sky sat low, dim, as if the storm had decided to linger just beyond sight. By then, weeks had passed since the first flood, and the neighborhood wore its damage like bruises under makeup. Painted fences, patched driveways, cheap gravel poured over soft ground that still oozed water underneath. Bethany, of course, acted like everything was under control. The HOA newsletter arrived printed on thick, cream-colored paper, full of cheerful language about community unity and temporary weather setbacks. There was even a photo of her standing in front of a new flower bed near the entrance sign, smiling like she'd tamed the sky. Marcus dropped the newsletter on my porch that morning, already folded in half. "You see this nonsense?" he asked, shaking his head. "She's pretending the floods never happened." I poured him coffee. "Pretending is cheaper than fixing." He nodded toward the binder sitting on my table. "How close are you?" "Closer than she knows," I said. Outside, a pickup rattled down Cottonwood Bend. The front tires splashed through a puddle that hadn't dried in weeks. The sound was dull, hollow, like slapping mud on a drum. We both turned to look as the truck slowed in front of the Hendersons' place. The driver got out, stared at the driveway, then knelt to touch the concrete. "See that?" Marcus murmured. "Foundations shifting." He was right. From where I sat, I could see a long, pale crack running from the corner of their garage toward the street, zigzagging like lightning frozen in stone. Over the next few days, the cracks multiplied. Driveways, patios, sidewalks, each line like the land trying to breathe under a blanket too tight. The rains had filled the soil beneath with water that had nowhere to go, and now it was pushing back. I documented everything. Photos at dawn, at noon, at dusk, timestamps, angles, measurements. Every time I passed Bethany on the street, she'd give me that same brittle smile. "Still taking pictures, Mr. Remy?" she'd ask. "Still making mistakes, Mrs. Whitfield?" I'd answer. That week, she called for another HOA inspection. A trio of men showed up with clipboards and bright orange vests, poking at storm drains and snapping photos of lawns like crime scenes. One of them, a younger guy with a nervous energy, came up to me while I was trimming branches near the fence. "You the homeowner here?" he asked. "Last I checked." He hesitated, glancing down at his form. "Off the record, sir. This place shouldn't have been touched. There's groundwater movement under this whole stretch. That concrete channel's blocking natural flow. Tell that to your client." He gave a half smile. "They don't listen to us. We just sign off what they pay for." When he left, I took a long walk down to where the concrete met the road. The slab had already started, to spiderweb, fine fractures catching the morning light like silver threads. I crouched and ran my fingers along one, feeling the faint warmth of trapped moisture below. The land wasn't just cracking. It was remembering where the creek used to run. By mid-October, the damage couldn't be ignored. Lawns tilted. Retaining walls bowed. The Patel's back porch had sunk 2 inches on one side, and the HOA's so-called flood mitigation garden near the playground was half underwater. Yet Bethany kept holding meetings in the community center, her tone steady, her hair unbothered. "Everything is under control," she declared at one gathering I attended just to listen. "We are taking proactive measures." "What kind of measures?" someone shouted from the back. Bethany adjusted her microphone. "A new drainage task force will be formed immediately. I'll be chairing it myself." A groan rolled through the crowd. I caught Marcus's eye across the room, and he mouthed, "Task force, my foot." As the meeting ended, Bethany caught me near the door. Her perfume was sharp and sweet, the kind that sticks in your throat. "Mr. Remy," she said, her voice low, "you've been quite active lately, taking photos, making calls. I hope you're not trying to cause unnecessary panic." "Just documenting facts," I said. "Well," she replied, straightening her papers, "facts can be misinterpreted." I looked her dead in the eye. So can lies. For the first time, her smile wavered. That night, another storm hit, short but violent. The sound of water pounding the concrete channel was like a drumline gone mad. I stood by the window, watching as the runoff surged against the slab, spilling over the edges and crawling across my yard like something alive. By dawn, the rain had stopped, but the neighborhood looked worse than ever. The Alvarez family's mailbox had toppled. Mr. Jensen's driveway split clean in two, and in front of Bethany's own house, a thin stream of brown water bubbled up through the decorative mulch like a spring. When I stepped outside, Marcus was already waiting at the fence. "You see that?" he said, nodding toward Bethany's yard. "Looks like the land's filing its own complaint," I said. He chuckled softly. "Guess it doesn't care about bylaws." I smiled back, but inside something heavier stirred. Satisfaction, yes, but also dread, because I knew the worst was still coming. The land had patience. It always did. And when it broke its silence completely, it wouldn't stop at cracks or puddles. It would take everything built on arrogance and wash it clean. I picked up the binder from my porch table, its edges damp from the morning air. The cover creaked as I opened it, revealing the growing stack of photos and notes inside. The weight of it felt different now, less like a record, more like a reckoning. "They thought they erased the creek," I murmured, flipping through the images. "The creek was only hiding." That afternoon, the air grew thick with the promise of rain again, but I didn't wait for it. I walked to the back shed, the one my grandfather built out of rough-cut pine when he first settled this land, and pulled open the warped door. The hinges groaned like old bones. Inside, the scent of oil, cedar dust, and rusted metal hit me like a memory. My grandfather had worked in that shed long after his hands stopped being steady, long after the world forgot the kind of patience men like him had. In the far corner, beneath a stack of weathered toolboxes and coffee cans filled with nails, sat an old cedar chest. The lock was stiff, but a twist of the screwdriver popped it loose. Inside lay his keepsakes, yellowed ledgers, hand-drawn maps, and a bundle of letters tied with twine. At the bottom, half buried under rags, I found a blue envelope. My name wasn't on it, but my family's stamp, an engraved R, was pressed into the corner. The paper crackled when I opened it. Inside were three things: a set of folded survey maps, a typed letter from the Montana State Water Board dated 1952, and a stamped document from the Department of Environmental Protection, 1978. Each one carried the same phrase: permanent natural drainage easement. I sat back on my heels and let out a slow breath. "You old fox," I whispered. My grandfather had known this day might come. He'd hidden the proof in plain sight, waiting for someone to listen. The rain started before I finished reading. It came soft at first, drumming on the roof of the shed like fingertips. I stayed there under the dim light, studying every seal, every signature, every line that proved what Bethany and her board had done wasn't just reckless, it was illegal. By the time the thunder rolled, I already knew my next move. That night, I called Sarah Coleman, the attorney. "I found something," I said, my voice low. "Old records, state-verified drainage easement, my land's part of a protected watershed." There was a pause on the other end. "Jake, if that's true, they didn't just violate a local ordinance. They violated state environmental law." "Exactly." I'll need copies, and your permission to file preliminary inquiries with the water board. You'll have them by morning." Before hanging up, she added, "Be careful. When people realize the land's against them, they start making noise." She was right. The next day, a white SUV idled in front of my house longer than usual. I recognized it, the HOA's inspection vehicle. I watched from behind the curtain as Bethany sat inside, pretending to check her phone. Then she drove off, slowly, like she wanted me to see her. That evening, I made my own noise. I scanned the documents, every page, every stamp. I filed a request with the county water board, attaching my findings. Then I sent the same packet, anonymously, to the state environmental office and a local reporter whose name Sarah had slipped me once. The email subject line read simply, "Unauthorized alteration of protected drainage system. Evidence attached." Before midnight, it was done. Outside, the storm deepened. The wind howled through the cottonwoods, and the first drops hit like cold pebbles against the window. I sat on the porch, binder open on my lap, rain splattering the pages. Somewhere down the street, a transformer buzzed, and the lights flickered. When the thunder broke, it rattled the nails in the rafters. I could almost hear my grandfather's voice beneath it, steady, calm. "You can't fence water, Jake. You can only guide it." The next morning, I woke to find tire tracks carved deep in the mud along my property line. Someone had driven through in the night, stopping near the edge of the old creek bed. There were footprints, too. Small, neat, expensive. Bethany's shoes, maybe, or one of her board lackeys. I snapped photos of everything and printed them. Evidence comes in layers, and so does truth. 3 days later, a white truck with a county seal rolled slowly down Cottonwood Bend. Behind it came a smaller car with the words, "State Environmental Office" stenciled on the door. They parked by the curb in front of my house. 2 inspectors stepped out, one older, one young and serious-looking. They asked to see the creek site. I led them through the gate, binder under my arm, boots sinking into wet ground. The older man crouched beside the slab of concrete and tapped it with a metal rod. "You said this was poured by the HOA?" "That's what the work order said." He frowned. "Without county permit?" "Without so much as a phone call." The younger inspector took soil samples, snapping pictures every few feet. They murmured to each other, pointing at the way the water had begun to creep back up through the seams. "You were right," the older man said finally. "That's a natural drainage channel. They've rerouted a state-recognized flow path. That's a violation under Section 12 of the Environmental Code." He glanced at me. "Mr. Remy, this might take some time, but the wheels are turning now." For the first time in months, I felt something like peace, thin and sharp, like sunlight breaking through a crack in the clouds. That evening, the storm returned, darker than before. Rain pelted the roof, thunder rolled through the valley, and the creek, my creek, stirred beneath the concrete, pushing against its prison. I stood at the window, watching the water rise, knowing it wasn't fury that moved it. It was memory. "Next time it rained," I said softly, "justice would flow with it." By dawn, it had. The rain didn't stop for 36 hours. Roads closed, culverts overflowed, and the whole subdivision looked like a shallow lake painted in gray and brown. The cottonwoods bent low, their roots drinking more than they could hold. The water came up to my porch steps again, lapping just under the boards. When the county trucks finally rolled in, they came with flashing blue lights and yellow tape. The inspectors from last week were back, now with clipboards thick with notes and faces that had lost any pretense of calm. Behind them came a second wave, men from the state, each carrying metal stakes and handheld scanners. I watched from the porch as they marked off the affected properties. The first unsafe structure tag went up at the Alvarez house, then the Jensens. Then, in a sight so satisfying it made me forget the damp in my boots, one bright red tag was hammered right into the mailbox post of Bethany Whitfield's home. I don't know if she was home to see it, but by the time the deputies arrived with their portable barricades, her silver Lexus was parked 3 houses down, water halfway up its tires. Sheriff McKay stepped out of his cruiser, hat pulled low against the rain. He saw me and gave a slow nod, the kind that means we both knew this was coming. "Morning, Jake," he said, his voice half drowned by the wind. "Morning, Sheriff." "Got a mess here." "Sure do." He eyed the concrete channel behind me, now cracked and bleeding muddy water through seams like an old scar giving way. "That the project?" "That's the one." He spat rainwater off his lip. "Damn shame. Would have been cheaper to leave it alone." The inspectors conferred under umbrellas, their radios hissing with updates from other neighborhoods. One of them pointed at the map, then at Bethany's lot. The ground there was bubbling, water pushing up through her prized rose garden, turning mulch to mud. By noon, the HOA's emergency meeting had turned into a circus. I didn't go, but Marcus did, and he called me halfway through. "They're in full panic mode," he said, his voice hoarse from shouting. "Bethany's blaming the county. County's blaming the HOA. One of the board guys quit on the spot." "She's still denying the pour?" "Not anymore. They showed her the permits, or rather, the lack of them." Through the phone I heard raised voices, a crash, then the echo of rain hammering the roof. "Jake," Marcus said, "they're talking fines, big ones. The sheriff's asking who signed the work order." "Who do you think?" Silence, then a low whistle. "She's cooked." I looked out across the street. The water had receded some, leaving silt like veins of ash across driveways. The air was thick with that post-storm smell, earth and ozone and something like rebirth. By late afternoon, news vans had found their way into the neighborhood. Their tires hissed through puddles as camera crews trudged out, pointing lenses at red tags and soggy lawns. A reporter in a bright blue raincoat interviewed an older man near the corner, and I caught just enough to hear the words "illegal drainage project." That evening, Bethany showed up at my porch. She didn't knock. She just stood there, soaked, makeup streaked, clutching a folder that sagged under the rain. "Jake," she said, her voice cracking, "we need to talk." I stepped outside, pulling the screen door shut behind me. "About what?" She looked like she hadn't slept. "This is spiraling out of control. The fines, the inspections. I didn't know it was protected land." I folded my arms. "You didn't ask." "I thought it was a simple runoff issue. You think I wanted this?" "Wanted it?" I gestured toward the muddy street. "You approved the pour. You signed the order. You watched them do it." Her lip trembled. "I was trying to protect the neighborhood." "From nature? From lawsuits? From flooding?" I laughed once, short and humorless. "You brought both." She blinked, water dripping from her lashes. "You could help me. You have the documentation. You could explain it was a misunderstanding, an oversight." I met her gaze evenly. "You think I built that binder to save you?" Her jaw clenched. "Then you're no better than what you claim I am." "Maybe," I said quietly. "But the difference is, I didn't pour concrete over the truth." She stared at me for a moment longer, then turned and walked down the path, her heels sinking into the mud. The rain had stopped, but her umbrella stayed closed. By nightfall, blue and red lights flashed down every street. Deputies escorted the last of the inspectors to their trucks, the beams from their flashlights bouncing off the wet asphalt. I watched it all from the porch, binder open on my lap, and wondered if this was what justice looked like, not loud or righteous, just inevitable. A knock came at my door near midnight. It was Sheriff McKay again, hat in hand. "Jake," he said, "county's opening an investigation. Environmental violations, public safety negligence, the works." "I figured," he sighed. "You might get called to testify." "I'll be ready." He studied me a moment. "You sleep okay, knowing this'll ruin half the folks here?" I looked out at the cracked slab, at the faint trickle of water seeping through it like veins coming back to life. "They built their houses on someone else's ignorance," I said. "Maybe this'll teach them what the land already knows." He nodded, slow and somber. "Well, Jake, looks like the HOA's paper walls finally cracked." When he left, I stayed up for hours listening to the wind scrape against the gutters. The storm had passed, but the sound of dripping water filled the night. Steady, patient, unstoppable. And beneath it all, faint but clear, I could hear the creek again. By morning, the valley was buzzing. The news had broken overnight. First local, then statewide. Unauthorized HOA project causes massive flooding. The story spread fast, each retelling a little sharper than the last. Photos from the inspector's reports splashed across the evening news. Cracked driveways, red tags, waterlogged homes. The HOA's name was printed in bold, and Bethany's signature sat beneath every work order like a scar. I watched it all unfold from the same porch where I'd once sat in silence. The binder lay open beside my coffee, half its contents already copied and sent to the county attorney's office. Every page now had a purpose beyond revenge. It was truth, sealed and documented. Marcus showed up around noon with a grin that didn't quite hide his disbelief. "You made the 6 o'clock news, Jake. They even showed your creek." I snorted. "Guess I should start charging admission." "Bethany's losing it," he said, dropping onto the porch rail. "She held an emergency meeting this morning. Tried to call the reporter biased and the county corrupt. Didn't go well. Half the board walked out on her." "She'll double down," I said. "People like her always do before they break." He nodded. "Still, gotta hand it to you. You played the long game." "I didn't play," I said softly. "I just watched the land keep score." That afternoon, a sheriff's deputy posted a notice on the HOA's community center door. "Official order of investigation. Pending civil action." A crowd gathered, whispering, snapping pictures. Bethany arrived late, hair pulled back tight, eyes hidden behind sunglasses, though the sky was gray. She stood there staring at the notice for a long minute before ripping it down and storming inside. The next day, the reporters came again, this time with cameras rolling. I didn't invite them, but they found me anyway. The driveway was still streaked with mud, the air smelling faintly of wet pine and diesel. "Mr. Remy?" one of them asked. "Did you expect this outcome when you first challenged the HOA?" I looked past the camera toward the cracked channel in my yard, where water now trickled freely through a break in the concrete. "I didn't challenge anyone," I said. "I defended what was already here." The clip aired that evening. They titled it, "The Creek That Fought Back." Bethany must have seen it, because the next morning her attorney filed a public statement claiming she'd been misled by contractors and pressured by fellow board members. But the county's evidence was already too deep. The contracts bore her signature, and so did the HOA's bank transfers. Thousands paid for unpermitted landscape restructuring. By week's end, the lawsuits began. The first from the county for environmental violations. The second from homeowners demanding restitution. Even the insurance companies joined the pile, citing gross negligence and willful misconduct. The HOA's lawyer resigned after 2 days, the treasurer disappeared from public view, and Bethany, well, she kept fighting, right up until the public hearing. The hearing was held at the county courthouse, the kind of building that smells like paper and history. I wore my cleanest jeans and the same denim jacket I'd had since my dam days. Sarah Coleman met me at the steps, her briefcase heavy with exhibits. "Ready?" she asked. "Been ready for months." Inside, the room was packed. Neighbors, reporters, inspectors. Bethany sat at the front table, pale but defiant. When the judge entered, the shuffle of bodies fell silent. Sarah laid out the case with the precision of a scalpel. The unauthorized pour, the easement documents, the flood data, the photos, and finally, my grandfather's original letter from the water board. Every exhibit landed like a hammer. Bethany's defense was thin. She tried to frame it as a community improvement gone wrong. But the judge wasn't buying it. He read aloud the final line from the state report. "Deliberate obstruction of a recognized watercourse in violation of Environmental Statute 12.4. When he finished, he looked over his glasses. "Mrs. Whitfield, this is not an improvement. This is negligence." For a moment, Bethany's shoulders dropped. Just a fraction, but enough to show the fight was over. The ruling came swift and clean. The HOA was to be dissolved pending litigation. Its funds seized to pay damages and restoration costs. The county would oversee the removal of the concrete channel and return the creek to its natural state. The courtroom murmured. Cameras clicked. And Bethany, still sitting, whispered something I couldn't quite hear. Sarah leaned over and said quietly, "You did it." But I didn't feel triumph, just a quiet exhaustion, like the air after a storm. When I stepped outside, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in weeks. Water still clung to the grass in beads, glinting like new glass. The courthouse steps were slick, and as I stood there, one of the reporters shouted after me, "No, Mr. Remy, any last words?" I turned slightly, just enough for the microphone to catch my voice. "Nature doesn't forget," I said, "and neither do I." The next morning, I woke to find work crews already at the end of the street. County trucks, excavators, hard hats. They moved with quiet efficiency, peeling up the concrete, letting the smell of wet earth rise again. I stood at my fence watching as the first chunk of gray broke free, exposing dark, glistening soil beneath. The water didn't hesitate. It trickled through the gap, winding its way home like it had been waiting all along. Later that evening, I flipped through the binder one last time. The pages were stiff with humidity, edges curled from use. I closed it gently, set it on the porch table, and exhaled. The fight was done, but the sound outside told a different story. Somewhere under the stars, the creek was whispering again, soft and steady, like a thank you. Maybe justice doesn't roar. Maybe it just flows. It took nearly a month for the county crews to finish what the court had ordered. The machines came first, yellow excavators chewing through concrete, their steel claws pulling up the slab that had strangled the creek. Each strike echoed down the valley like thunder. The sound wasn't destruction, it was release. Neighbors gathered behind yellow tape, watching silently as the last piece of gray fell away. Some wore the same blank expressions I'd seen when the floods came, caught between guilt and disbelief. Marcus stood beside me, arms crossed, a coffee thermos in his hand. "Looks like the land's getting the final word," he said. "It always does," I replied. The air smelled different that day, earthy, raw, alive. Beneath the torn-up trench, the soil glistened black, heavy with memory. Workers used shovels to guide the first trickle of water back along its natural path. It curved gently through the yard, sliding between stones that hadn't seen daylight in years. Within hours, dragonflies began to hover above it, their wings catching sunlight like fragments of stained glass. By evening, the water ran clear. The next morning, volunteers from the environmental office arrived with saplings and bundles of native grasses. They planted along the edges of the new channel, shaping the banks with care. Even a few of the homeowners, those who'd once complained about that unsightly creek, joined in. Maybe guilt, maybe gratitude. Either way, they got their hands dirty. I kept mostly to myself, watching from the porch as the land knitted itself back together. Every day, the creek's voice grew stronger, a soft murmur in the mornings, a steady song by dusk. Bethany's house sat empty now. The bank had reclaimed it after the lawsuits, and the for sale sign leaned crooked against her yard. The roses she'd planted had drowned, their stems brittle under the autumn sun. Sometimes, when the wind blew just right, I thought I could still hear the faint rustle of her heels clicking across her old patio. But it wasn't her anymore. It was just the sound of water moving beneath the ground, erasing what needed to be forgotten. One afternoon, as the crews packed up the last of their equipment, Sheriff McKay stopped by. He parked at the curb, stepping out slow, hat tilted against the light breeze. "Looks good," he said, nodding toward the creek. "It's back where it belongs." He smiled, lines deepening at the corners of his eyes. "County signed off this morning. Official restoration complete." I exhaled, long and quiet. "Feels strange," I said. "After all that noise, it's just over." McKay shrugged. "Justice is like water, Jake. It doesn't always come fast, but it gets there. Finds every crack." He tipped his hat, then turned toward his cruiser. "Take care of yourself, and of this place." "I will." That night, I lit a lantern and carried it down to the creek's edge. The water moved lazily. Under the glow, silver ripples brushing against the reeds. I knelt and touched the surface. Cool, alive, real. The current carried a leaf past my hand, swirling before disappearing into the dark. For the first time in months, I didn't feel anger, just stillness. The land was healing, and maybe I was too. When I walked back up toward the porch, I stopped by the old oak near the fence. The wood was rough beneath my palm, carved faintly with the R my grandfather had marked decades ago. Beside it, I planted a small wooden sign I'd made myself. The letters were simple, cut with my pocket knife and painted dark against the grain. "Nature always wins." The words stood clean and solid against the pale moonlight. The next morning, the neighborhood looked different. Not newer, just honest. Mud had replaced manicured lawns, and the mirror of still water shimmered beneath the cottonwoods again. Children rode their bikes along the edge of the road, splashing through puddles without fear. The creek had become what it always was, a reminder that you can't own what the earth lets you borrow. Weeks passed, and life settled. Marcus rebuilt his workshop higher on the slope. Mrs. Jensen planted cattails along her property line. Even the HOA's remnants, the few residents still clinging to titles, voted to dissolve what was left of the association. The paperwork, stamped and sealed, felt lighter than it should have. One afternoon, I sat by the water with Sarah Coleman. She was off duty, hair pulled back, boots muddy from helping replant the last section near the cul-de-sac. "You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked. "Used to," I said. "Now I just think about keeping it the way it was meant to be." She smiled. "You did good, Jake." "Didn't do much," I said, skipping a stone across the current. The land did most of the work. The stone bounced once, twice, and then sank without a sound. We sat there a while, listening to the steady rhythm of the creek, the low hum of crickets, the sigh of the wind through the cottonwoods. As dusk settled, the water caught the last of the sun's fire, reflecting it in streaks of orange and gold. I felt the weight of the binder beside me, its pages filled with months of struggle and proof. I opened it one last time, flipped to the final photo. A drone shot of the neighborhood before the storm, before the damage, before the greed. Then I closed it for good. Some things are better left written in water. Before heading inside, I looked back toward the stream one final time. It curved through the field like a line drawn by a patient hand. The air smelled of wet soil and promise. "The creek remembers," I said under my breath. The wind carried the words away, and the water whispered them back. If you've ever stood your ground for what's right, you know justice doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stand firm. Drop a justice in the comments if you've ever had to. Fight for your own piece of peace. And if stories like this remind you what it means to protect what's yours, stick around. Hit subscribe and ride with us for the next tale of land, law, and quiet revenge under the wide American sky.